to do this workshop, I thought, wow, this is a great idea because I know that report writing is anxiety producing for CASA volunteers. When we train our volunteers in Delaware, we tell them in the beginning of our training that there are 3 crises that every CASA volunteer goes through. The first crisis is your first interview. You've had your training and you feel like you're all ready to go, and then you have to really do it. The second crisis is having to write your first report because you've got all this information, and the question then is, what am I going to do with it? And your third crisis is the first time you really need to go to court. And I think my message to you to start out with is, if you feel a little anxious at those times, it's normal. It's okay. It's a good time to call upon the staff in your program for some guidance and support. So that was the first message I wanted to give to you. And after Marcel had asked me, and I thought, well, yeah, this is a great idea to do, I started to prepare this workshop, and I thought, well, gee, there are only 800 different ways, now 843 different ways within our network that we are writing reports. So how am I going to bring all of this information together without contradicting what volunteers are being taught on the local level? Well, what I decided to do was to do some of the basics. We're not going to deal with content as much as process in writing a report, and as much as techniques that you can use to help make it easier for yourself. I will tell you that in an hour and a half, it's not going to be possible for me to teach you everything, but I hope that we'll be able to have some tips that'll make life easier for you and reduce some of the anxiety that you might feel. So today we're going to really talk about report writing for CASA volunteers. This is a workshop, so we will work. The handout that you have is some exercises that we're going to be doing throughout this morning. One of the first things that we're going to talk about this morning is why we write reports to begin with. If it's so difficult, if it's so anxiety producing, why are we doing this? Different times that we write reports, a few tips, the use of formats. How many of you in your programs have some kind of guidance or format that you use? All right, just about everybody. And throughout our training this morning, we're going to be doing some practice exercises. From your perspective, what are the reasons we write reports? Why do we do it?
To give information.
Give information. What else? Speaking for a child. Okay, you're projecting that child's needs with your report. What else?
Documenting. Facilitate communication.
Facilitating communication. Documenting what you found. Influencing. Backing your recommendations. Very good. A lot of times judges announce their decisions from the bench, and sometimes they don't. And if they don't, this provides a document that judges can take back and reread and think about, because there's a lot of information that comes out in a short time in a court hearing. So this gives them something to turn back to. The documentation of facts is very important. Sometimes those are the things that judges need to refer back to in making decisions. In a lot of programs in the state of Delaware, for example, our CASA reports are introduced as evidence in the court hearing. So if that's a case, that helps establish a legal record, and that can influence decision making. So as a piece of evidence, the judge can determine how much weight goes on your report. And we also know that other parties in the proceeding would get a copy or get an opportunity to review that report. And we want to keep that in mind. How many of you testify when you go to court? All right, a lot of you do that. So if you have all of your information summarized, that really helps provide a basis for your testimony, something that you can use to hit the high points. The other thing that I think is very important about CASA reports is it's not unusual for the CASA report to be something that facilitates a settlement in a case. It may be that the sides, the parents and the agency are not seeing things eye to eye, and the CASA report that's focused on the child can sometimes help both sides give a little bit. Now, I think that we can sometimes feel a little bit let down. We're all ready to go to court. We've done all the investigating, written the report, and things get settled on the steps of the courtroom. But that's a good thing. If it's something that's right for the child, it's a lot easier on everyone to not have to go through the adversarial process and people buy in. So that's another very important tool that you have to get what you want for the children that you serve. Reports are written at different times. There are different stages in court proceedings, as you know. Just about any hearing that you go to, you need a report, right? And your report may be a little bit different depending on what is happening at the stage in your case. But in the beginning, you're summarizing your information and presenting your recommendations. And you have judges then that sometimes will ask for an update. Let me know in a couple of months or a couple of weeks whether this particular thing that I ordered is happening. Let me know about the status. And the time that we like to write reports is when it's time to close out a case and say to the judge, this child is in a safe and permanent home, we're happy with the results, and we're ready to move on and serve another child. When I was preparing for this workshop, one of the things that I did was to call some of my colleagues around the country who are program directors and ask them to send me copies of what they were using in their report format so that I could see if there was some kind of consistency. And actually I found that there was. One of the things that I found as a consistency is that most programs were asking for identifying information. That is, who's this case about? Tell me about the child, who are the parents. So at some place in your report, there's a request for identifying information. And so it's important to get that right. How many people have ever had their name mispronounced or misspelled? All right. How'd you feel about that? Not very good. How did that impact your perception of the person who was mispronouncing or misspelling your name? It decreases their credibility, doesn't it? So one of the things that we want to do early on is make sure we get that right. And think about when you're interviewing folks. When you're interviewing folks, if you say to them, I want to make sure I get this right, what does that do to the level of trust they may have in you? What does that do to your credibility with the people that you're working with, no matter who they are? Does it make you feel, it increases it? Sure it does. Okay, so you want to make sure you get that identifying information right, and you may need to check that with the source. Anybody ever find a mistaken spelling in a court file? All right, or a gender of a child, or a birth date. So those are the things you want to double check and make sure it's right. The next thing that I found is that there's background information that a lot of programs are requiring. The question here is, how did we get to this point? When did the child enter care, if they're in foster care, or how did the issue come before the court? What's the background? And here's the reason for that. Judges are hearing many, many cases every day. We are living with one or two at a time. So that information is fresh to us, it's important to us, and we know it like that. But a judge has to sort that out and try to remember who this is in relation to the other couple of thousand kids that they're looking after. So that capsule is to remind the judge or to bring the judge up to date. Here's who this is about, here's why, here's the stage of the proceeding, and here are the issues that need to be decided. Here's how we got to where we are. Those are all factual information, not your opinion, the facts. You can get that information from a lot of court documents or reports in your court files. Another issue that's usually addressed in courts is the agency involvement. What has your child protection agency been doing in working with this family? What is their perception of the family needs? What services have they provided? And how well is that working? And are there any gaps in services? So that piece that belongs to here's what the agency is doing is a common thread in CASA reports around the country. Another part is the parents. What about the parents? Who are they? What are they doing? What is their life like? How do they perceive the issues surrounding their child? How do they see themselves taking advantage of services? What problems exist that haven't been addressed? These are things that you get from your interview with the parents. Depending on the nature of your court, for example, in Delaware, our volunteers generally write narratives that are 10 pages long. Yeah, okay. And 2 of them are here to tell you they have survived doing that, right? In a lot of states I've heard, well, we don't want anything that's more than 2 pages. So you need to be thinking about that as we go along, and how much information is the critical piece that the judge needs to hear. One of the most, probably the most important part of your report is your description of the child. You are the only one in the courtroom who has the exclusive responsibility of painting a picture of that child for the judge. You need to know how that child is thinking and feeling and adjusting. And you want the judge to be able to close his or her eyes and visualize that child. When we're talking about summarizing and effectiveness, you have the ability to humanize a case file and turn it into a person for the judge. So you want to really give some thought to that. And you also want the judge to know if the child has any particular wishes. And we all know that children's wishes may change from time to time, and it's okay to say that. If a child has a consistent point of view from start to finish, you can let the judge know that, whether or not it's the same as your recommendation. Or if the child's feelings change from time to time, that's fine. That's normal for kids. But it helps the judge know that you've been talking about that with the child and what their needs are and what their feelings are. And of course, that's all based on the age and maturity of children. Many reports are looking for caregivers information. That is, how, if the child is in foster care, how are they adjusting? Or if they're living with relatives, how are they doing? And that's information, of course, that you would get from whoever is caring for the child, and your own personal observations. Information from collateral contacts. What do you think we mean by collateral contacts? Who might that be?
Teachers.
Teachers. Who else? Other agencies. Counselors. Attorneys. Neighbors. Doctor. Churches. So anybody outside the agency and the caregivers and the parents, anybody else that you talk to who has some significant information is a collateral contact. And you want to be able to say, this is who I talked to and this is what they told me, this is what I learned about the child. In the reports that I've seen, and it's done in different ways, there is a way to evaluate what you've learned. Everything we're talking about so far has been fact, 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 fact. Not what you think about it, not how you interpret it, but this is what was reported to me, this is what I observed, this is what I heard through my eyes, ears, nose, touch, whatever, using your 5 senses. And then there is a place, and it's different in the reports that I've seen, where you can say, now that I have all this information, this is what I think about it. This is what I think it means. And we're going to go through some talk about that. And that's where you want to stress the parts that you think are important. For example, you may have documented facts about when this child entered foster care, how they're feeling about being with their parents, and a message you may want to give to the judge in your evaluation that needs to be clearly separate from the facts is that this child has been in foster care for 90% of his or her life. This child feels a desperate need to have a stable place to live. So that's a place where you can put some interpretation on the facts, but you need to clearly separate it from the factual part. And then the next part that I saw in every report are recommendations. Now, your recommendations should never be a surprise. When your recommendations appear on your report, the judge should be able to say, well, gee, that's a logical conclusion from the facts that have been presented so far. It makes sense because A plus B plus C equals recommendation. So whenever you're writing recommendations, you want to go back in the body of your report and say, did I have anything in there to support that recommendation? Are there facts in there that would lead to this conclusion? And then there's usually some kind of closing, and people are different on how they sign their reports, but there's usually some standard way to indicate who the report came from with a signature. And also I saw in reports there is a request for documentation of your sources of information, and we're going to talk about some ways to do that. What I would recommend is that you use the format that your program provides for you. And the reason for that is that every judge and court looks at things a different way. And I don't want to tell you something that's different from what your own program is telling you. And that's because they know their own court system. If your program doesn't provide a report format I would go to your staff and ask that they do, because that will help you arrange your materials. When you're documenting your contacts, in Delaware they come at the end of the report, in other places I saw them at the beginning of the report. Doesn't really matter. Why is it important to do that? Why do you need to do that?
For support for your evaluation and your recommendations.
Support your evaluation and recommendations. Any other thoughts about why?
It really helps when you date things, because then you see what the chronology is, as when you're reading something new, that this happened when.
Okay.
The judge understands the big picture.
It helps date things so that the judge can see a sense of the chronology. Good. It also adds to your credibility. If the judge sees a report that has 2 contacts in it, and a judge sees a report that has 20 contacts in it, which at face value is the more credible report, which is the more thorough indication of information gathering. So I think that's one of the things that you want to do. It's a pain in the neck. It's a pain in the neck to do it, but it's important to do it. And when you do those contacts, in general, make sure that you have the date, the person or record that you saw or interviewed spelled correctly, and if they have a title, the correct title. If they work for an organization, the correct organization. And usually the type of contact, was it a telephone call or an office visit or an observation or a review of a record or a meeting, so that you have all of that in context. And I've seen the documentation done in a number of different ways. Some people document by date, just list things chronologically. Others by person. Mary Jones is the person that I talked to, and then you might list all the different dates that you talked. And another is by type. Here are all the office visits I had. Here are all the phone calls that I made. Now your own program may have a preference for how you do it, but I think the important thing is that you have all of the information. Here are some examples of different ways to document your contacts. The first set is chronological by date, and you can see we have the date. Oh, it is Mary Jones. I thought I just pulled that name out of a hat. Okay. Mary Jones and what her relationship is to the case, and here it was a phone call. All right. The next thing that happens was a contact with the child, Sharon Raymond, and her mother, and that was an observed visit. So you can see one way to do it. Another way is by person, and just pulling one person out, Mary Jones. Here are all the different contacts that I had with her. I had phone calls at these times, office visits at these times, whatever. And in the end, by type. And I think this is probably the least preferable way to do it. It's probably more complicated for you. But here are all the phone calls that I had. Here are all the visits that I made. One of the things that we do in Delaware is we provide all of our volunteers with a calendar. And they can use that to document all of their contacts. And when it's time to write your reports, you can just whip that out and write them down. And the other thing that you can do, we have another chart that we use that's just for documenting contacts, where we can put in the person's name, their relationship to the case, and then there's a spot to write down all of the contacts with that individual. One of the things I would suggest to you very strongly is start doing that as soon as your case is assigned. Because like I said, it's a tedious thing to do, it's a pain in the neck to do, and if you start from the beginning and have all of that as you go along, it's one less thing that you have to worry about when it's time to finalize your report. I think the problem with that, two things. One is you need to know the culture of your court and how much information your judge wants. Secondly, summarizing with things like numerous. Here's the problem. What does numerous mean? How many contacts does numerous mean? 2 or more. How many contacts does numerous mean?
10.
How many contacts does numerous mean? 20. All right? So that's the problem. We had 2, 10, 20. So what does numerous mean? I think that can create a problem for you.
What we do is we just give the total.
Give the total.
For the person, we list phone calls
Okay.
in the column,
That's another way to do it.
14
Mhm.
person visits with each day.
Okay, that's another way to do it. We had 14 visits, but I would put that within a time frame between this date and this date.
That would be since this last date to this current.
All right, good. That's another suggestion. Another way to do it is to list the total number of contacts within a specific period of time. One of the things that I think is really important as you're writing your report is to make sure that you write clearly and say what you mean and mean what you say. Make sure your writing is legible and that you use complete sentences. If you take a look at the 3 examples down here, you can see the kind of problems that you run into if your writing's not clear. Okay?
I would fall asleep for 40 years. After what day?
I had been driving for 40 years when I fell asleep at the wheel and had an accident. Is that what that person meant to say? No. So one of the things that you can do as you write your report, write it all down, put it aside, sleep on it, pull it out the next day and look at it again and pretend you're somebody else who's seeing it for the first time. And ask yourself, does this make sense? If I'm reading it for the first time, and try to erase all the things you know. I think a difficulty that volunteers run into is that you know so much about your case that as you're reading your report, you're assuming everybody knows all those things you haven't said. So it's real important, I think, to put it aside and then pull it out and see if it still makes sense to you. Here's another idea, and that may be helpful for some and not for others. One suggestion is, would it be helpful to read it out loud? Maybe it would be for you. Try it.
I noticed you didn't recommend like having someone proofread it. So it's
We haven't gotten to that yet. The comment here is, I noticed you didn't recommend that somebody proofread it. We didn't get to that part yet. How many of you are required to have some of the program staff review your report? Turn around and look. Just about everybody. It's a great idea. It ought to happen.
In fact, in our system, the secretary does the final report. So if we don't have it all just so, she picks up and she takes care of all of the grammar and all of the detail type stuff.
One of the questions here is that one of the comments here is that the secretary takes care of all the grammar and details and final stuff. But think about this. How many volunteers are in your program? How many different handwritings does that secretary need to be able to read? How many abbreviations, and names and all that does the secretary need to be able to sort out? The point here is that if you're giving that kind of information to your secretary in any form, make sure they can read it, because your secretary can be your best friend. Or, I know my secretary, she lets me know if things are not in a way that she can work with them. And you don't want to hand in something with handwriting or even if it's on a disc where there's a typo that's going to be repeated, or you can't tell an E from an I or an A from an O. So you want, especially in names, you want to make sure that when you hand things in that they're legible. Let's take a look at this example in terms of clarity. Laura is 7 years old. She has lived in the foster home of Jane Briggs for 3 months. Ms. Briggs is a teacher. She told me that she is very pleased with this placement. She said that she visits her mother every Saturday afternoon. She enjoys these visits very much. What do you think about that? What's the problem? Who is she? Is it clear? Do you think the writer maybe knows in their own mind who she is? But is it clear to the reader? This is something that's not unusual, excuse me, to see in a CASA report. Not only with she's, but a lot of pronouns that are repeated, and we're not sure who they're referring to. This could mean Laura, couldn't it? But it also could mean Mrs. Briggs, couldn't it? So when you put your report away and come back and look at it again, ask yourself in each sentence, is it clear who I'm referring to when I use pronouns? Have I used them too much? Are there places where I need to make sure I put a name in or rephrase my sentences so that it's clear who I'm talking about? Let's look at this example in terms of structure. Martin Scott, Joey's father, works at local grocery store, wants to care for a child but lacks stable housing. Caseworker feels reunification if dad can get finances stable. Visits take place every Saturday and Sunday. Mr. Scott has not missed a visit since Joey entered foster care. Child looks forward to visits. Caseworker verifies that dad keeps visits and report dad actively involved with parenting classes.
Incomplete sentences.
Okay, how would you fix this? What's the first thing that you would want to fix here?
Say Martin Scott, comma, Joey's father, comma, works at a local grocery store.
That's one way to do it. Is there another way to Martin Scott, comma, Joey's father, comma, works at a local grocery store? Is there another way to do it?
Bulletin. I would just bullets. Sometimes we do that. We have lots of information.
In some reports, bulleting is permitted. That would not be acceptable in our state, but in some it is. But would you leave it like this? Martin Scott, bullet, bullet. Martin Scott, Joey's father, bullet. No. Works at local grocery store, bullet.
No, I would think that.
No, I wouldn't do it that way.
What would you do differently?
Some of the information comes from Martin, but some comes from other people.
All right, so you want to be sure what's connected with whom. What else might you do here? Parentheses. You could put parentheses. Martin Scott, parentheses, Joey's father.
This
What
is
else?
Probably several different areas too at the same time.
It could be.
Some could be put in other areas of the report. It looks like it's missed.
So you want to look at organizationally, do we have the right things together? How about Martin Scott is Joey's father? Who or he works at a local grocery store? There are several ways to do this. There's no one perfect way. But check to see if you have complete sentences. Check to see, look at the last sentence. Caseworker verifies that dad keeps visits, report dad actively involved with parenting classes. See a problem with that? I'm sorry?
Why haven't you looked at the case file? Why haven't you?
Well, maybe you have, and maybe this is just what your caseworker is telling you, but you're right. You need to look at it. You could name the caseworker. Is there anything wrong with the structure of that sentence? It's two ideas, right? We've got an awful lot in there together that are not directly related to each other. So you want to look at your reports for organization. Do I have the right things together? We have a volunteer, and there are different ways that you can organize your notes. So when you're thinking report writing, think, how am I keeping my notes? Some people like to keep things chronologically. Some people like to have a notebook where it's divided into different people that they contact. We have one volunteer in Delaware who's very active in children's theater. And she organizes her reports in terms of, I mean, she doesn't write it this way, but Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. And it makes sense to her because there's a logical progression. Some people write things down on index cards or keep different file folders. There's no one perfect way to do it. Think about what works for you. How is your life organized? What would work? But don't wait until you're ready to write your report to think about how you're going to organize your facts so that they're easily accessible to you. And as you're gathering your facts, it's a good idea to highlight or make yourself a special note. Here's something that's really important that I want to make sure I say in my report. Because you're going to have lots of notes, aren't you? And you're going to need to read through all of your notes to try to figure out what those important pieces are. And if you take a highlighter or put a little star in the side or something to indicate to yourself that here's something I want to remember and make sure I include. The other thing that is helpful is as you go along, how many of you have regular contact with the staff? Have a supervisor that works with you? All right. And aren't you talking with that person all along about your case? And aren't they saying to you that's really important? All right. Make notes of that because they're giving you clues all along about the kinds of things that are going to be important. The other thing I would really suggest to you, if you don't already do this in your program, is ask to have some good reports put aside that you can look at and read and reread as examples. People don't come into the CASA program with a lot of experience writing reports. So it's something that you learn over time, and the more you do it, the better you get at it. But look at other good examples and use them as models.
During my court report writing class, I always give an example.
Okay.
Actual report example for them to go by the format.
Right.
How we want the information.
Right. And what the comment was during report writing in this program, new volunteers are given an example, a sample report that they can to use as a format. It's a great thing to do. The difficulty, I think, is sometimes in training we get a lot of stuff, right? And then when we go to do it, we forget about that stuff. So we need to go back and pull it out again. Remember that it's there. They're tools. So some tips for writing reports. You want to keep in touch with your supervisor and talk about what the important things are. They're there to help you and guide you and support you. So that's a time that you can use this person as one of your tools for learning. And that supervisor is also responsible for making sure that you've got all the critical information, that you haven't left out something that's important, that you have made the visits you need to make, that you have reviewed the records you need to review. So use that as a tool. Also, the formats that are provided by your program, don't hide them, take them home and hide them after training. Know where they are, be able to pull them out, be able to use them. The other thing that as I suggested to you a minute ago, I think it's really a healthy thing, it's really a helpful thing to write your report, put it away, pull it out again and read it with fresh eyes when you're not tired. And that means that you can't write your report the day before it's due, right? One of the things I promised every program director that I would talk to you about is this, and you'll hear it again. Please get your reports in on time. On time. It's critical. It's critical. We'll talk about why. When you're reviewing your report, you want to look at it for both content and form. So you want to think about, did I include everything that's important? And did I include it in a way that makes sense? Is it readable to somebody who's seeing it for the first time? Did I provide the kind of information that is going to paint the picture I want to paint? Is it thorough and is it objective? Is it redundant to the judge who's had this, who's seeing other cases in between? It may be necessary, and as you're evaluating your information, if your concern is this case isn't going anywhere, where would you address that? Where? When you're evaluating your facts, right? You have your facts that this is still the same for the child, this is still the same for the child, this is still the same for the child. And when you're evaluating your facts, that's where you can point out, you know, Judge, I mean, these aren't the words you would use, but I've told you this on this date, and I've told you this on this date, and I've told you this. And my concern is that for 2 years, we haven't had movement. So my view is that I would use that evaluation section, whatever you call it in your individual reporting, to emphasize that lack of movement. And then think about your recommendations. And are there new recommendations that you can make? One of the things that you need to be careful about with that, and this really depends on your court, is whether or not attachments are permitted. In some courts, psychological reports and other kinds of reports are permitted to be attached. In others, they are not. They would have to be introduced separately as evidence. So that's a question you would need to ask in your own program, whether or not attachments are appropriate.
Our reports are just from the last hearing to current day. It's
Right.
not, you know,
Yeah.
what happened 2 years ago. It's from February to June or
Right.
whatever that time period
The
is.
comment here is that a second report picks up where the last one left off. And again, that depends on the nature of your court and how, what the judge's expectations are there. With your content, you want to make sure that you get first-hand information. You don't want to put in your report that the foster mother told me that the teacher said, that the guidance counselor said, that the bus driver thought. You know, that's not first-hand information. CASA reports by nature are hearsay, which is a big enough problem. And when we have double, triple, quadruple hearsay, we compound the problem. How many people have ever played Whisper Down the Lane? Okay? That's what this multiple hearsay is all about. And that doesn't help your credibility because you haven't gone and gotten the information yourself. So that's what you want to do. Be the one, be as close to the source as you can be. The other thing you want is current information. Current information. We know that at the last minute things can change in surprising ways, don't we? All right, so you want to make sure that before you start writing your report, you're up to date on everything that's happened. It's not going to help your credibility, and it's certainly not going to help this child if you haven't seen them for several months and the information that you have is old and outdated. And the other thing that happens then is people who have been doing what they're supposed to be doing will come in with more current information, and what happens with the credibility of your report? You know? What good is this? This is old news. So you want to make sure that you not only have historical information, but you have currently what the status is. Another thing is you want your report to be complete. Now, we know that by the time you're ready to write a report, you have a vision of where things ought to end up, right? All right. And we want to bolster that vision. We want to bolster those recommendations with all the good stuff that we can to say, here's why I'm right. Right? That part's okay. However, suppose we have information that might be persuasive in a different direction. Do we, you know, hide that? What do we do with that? We report it. How come?
Because we want to give the complete picture of
We
the situation.
report it because we want to give the complete picture of the situation. How many of you have kids? Do kids ever get in squabbles with each other? All right. Do you listen to one side and say, you're completely right? No. That's not credible, is it? We know that there are two sides to every story, and we know that a judge, on balance, is going to be able to see the picture if we have the facts to back it up. Sometimes it looks like this. It's real clear. There's not a whole lot of good or a whole lot of bad. You know, the balance is clear. And sometimes it's kind of like this, isn't it? It's not that clear. Is that okay? Yes, it is, because these cases are not black and white. There's a whole lot of gray in here. And your credibility, which leads to the effectiveness of your report, hinges on how thorough and objective you are. If you're seen as someone who is only willing to see one side of the story and not even consider anything that may look in a different direction, what's going to happen to the effectiveness of your recommendations? They're going to decrease, aren't they? Because the question will arise, are all material facts being presented here? Is there a bias that I need to be worried about? The other thing you want to do is make sure that you use descriptive information. Suppose that I went to a house yesterday and it was dirty. Okay, tell me what that means. What's dirty mean? What's it mean?
She came to my house.
There was dust on top of the refrigerator.
Dust on the refrigerator. What does dirty mean? Dishes in the sink. What does dirty mean? Clutter. What does dirty mean? Feces on the floor. So we've gone from dust on the refrigerator to feces on the floor, meaning dirty. All right? So what does it mean? Different things to different people. However, if I went to a house and I said what I saw was dust on the refrigerator, you've got a picture in your mind, don't you? If you write in your report, I went to the house and I saw feces on the floor, you've got a different picture in your mind, don't you? And isn't the picture clearer than saying it was dirty? So you want to be very descriptive about what you see. You are the paintbrush. You want to paint the picture for the judge. You want the judge to be able to close his or her eyes or leave them open, whatever their preference is, and see what you saw and hear what you heard. Be the paintbrush. We also want to report things in context. Mother is not going to her parenting classes consistently. What does that mean?
What's consistently?
What does consistently mean? How many has she made? How many has she missed? Do we know? Do we know over what period of time? So what does that mean? Subject to a lot of interpretation, isn't it? So the more factual you can be, the more descriptive you can be, the better paintbrush you will be. Let's look at fact or opinion and what the red flags are. Let's take a look at some of these sentences, and you also have them on your handout, to take a look at some of these sentences, and let's talk about what you like or don't like about them. We're not going to worry about whether they have the right information, but just think about what's factual or what's opinion here. The house that Ellen Weston lives in is dirty and unhealthy for a little child. Miss Weston does not want anyone to help her learn how to be a better housekeeper. What are your thoughts about that?
How do you know she doesn't want anybody to help her?
How do you know she doesn't want anybody to help her? So we're missing a source of information here. What else do you see here?
An opinion about being unhealthy for the child.
Right, do we know what unhealthy means? And we don't know what dirty means. So, and that's an opinion, isn't it? It's an opinion.
The second part could be fact if you stated that Mrs. Weston said she does not want.
All right, that would provide your source of information. The comment here is that you could say Mrs. Weston said she does not want. Now the next question I have is, so what?
Yeah.
Does it matter Is it important? If we're talking about dust on the refrigerator, it might not be a big deal. If we're talking about feces on the floor, it might matter. So another question that you always want to ask yourself is, does it matter? Is it material to what the judge has to decide? Is it a critical issue in the case? Is it something that is going to influence thinking one way or another, or something that is just bothering me personally? Let's look at the next sentence. Sharon is really too young to be going to school for a full day. She would be better off spending more time with her foster mother or visiting with her grandmother. A lot of opinion there. What could make that change? How old? Well, what if I said Sharon is 5 years old and she's really too young to be going to school for a day?
Standards. Did you go to talk to the kindergarten teacher or?
So what are we missing? How do we know? Source of information. Without a source of information here, it's an opinion. It's like, this is what I have concluded. However, if Sharon's kindergarten teacher said to you, this child is really too young to be here for a full day, what would you need to do to this sentence to change it? You want to report your source. Sharon's teacher, let's make her Mary Jones, reported this to me. Same thing with she'd be better off spending a day with her grandmother. Where's that coming from? How do we know? If that's the way it's written, it's your opinion. We talked about painting a picture with words, which is the next thing that you want to do, and describing the child. Very important. Remember, you want that paintbrush. You want to be the one who paints the picture for the judge. We talked about including the child's expressed wishes, if there are any, and whether or not the child's been consistent about that. And I think it's very critical to make sure that, and double check, that your recommendations flow from the facts that you've presented. I'd like you to take a look at the next exercise that you have. How would you critique this writing? And we're going to do this together. Take a minute and read about Holly Lewis. Just those 2 paragraphs. Holly's been in foster care since February 5th, 1999. She seems really happy there. On my most recent visit, her foster mother said that Holly enjoys finger painting. This seems to be a wonderful foster home. They have another child also. Mrs. Lewis has failed to attend recommended treatment for drugs and mental illness. When I met Mom, she kept talking about herself. I've never met a person so preoccupied with her own needs. She was confused about her children but loves them. She says she tries to get to visits but can't always make it because of the bus schedule and she doesn't drive. She said that the agency service plan is too hard to do all at once. She has some major hurdles to overcome. If you are a program director or coordinator, whatever you call the staff, and this report was handed to you, this isn't the whole report, but this piece of the report, what kind of feedback would you give to the CASA volunteer who wrote this?
She's too judgmental.
All right, the comment here is she's too judgmental. Give me an example. Because you told me that
Okay.
I'm the CASA volunteer. You told me I'm too judgmental, but I don't know what you're talking about. Give me the example of where judgment comes through.
I've never met a person so preoccupied with
I've never met a person so preoccupied with herself. There's a judgment in there, and isn't that so what question one that also needs to be asked here? So what? We always have to be aware of our own personal values and be looking to see am I saying this is not the way I want my life to be? Or are we saying this is unsafe for this child? I think that's an excellent point, that we always need to be looking at those kinds of things in context. And thinking about the threshold question that the judge has to decide. So the question to ask yourself all the time is, so what? Does it matter here? Is it in context? Is it factual? We don't know where all this information is coming from, so there's a lot of sources of information that are missing. We don't know if somebody else said Holly likes to finger paint, or if Holly told us that. We don't know what makes her happy. What does that mean? And whose eyes are we seeing that through? What else bothers you about this? What else would you want to change?
I want to know about the other child.
All right.
What sex is it? How old?
Is it a foster child or a biological child? So where does this child fit into the picture? If we're going to say there's another child there, we need to ask ourselves, how come we're telling the judge that? What difference does it make? Does it matter? Maybe it does. Maybe this is a sibling. Maybe this is a child of the family and they get along great, or they don't get along at all. You know, maybe this is somebody that is a support for Holly. Maybe this is somebody that is a problem for Holly. So why are we telling the judge this? Why are we telling, who is this child, and why are we telling the judge? To summarize, just some of the things we need to look at here are, is there a factual basis for what we're writing? Have we identified the sources of information? Is the information important to the court? Does it matter? Is it relevant to what we're trying to say? And have we carefully looked at what's fact and what's opinion? Now let's look at the next section, what makes this better? And let's this time try to identify what's good about this report. 7-year-old Holly Lewis has been in foster care since 2005-99. Holly says she's happy in her current placement and that she enjoys finger painting. The medical records from her most recent physical examination on 3/1/99 describe Holly as a healthy child. Mrs. Davenport, my sister by the way, Holly's second grade teacher at Oak Grove School, reports that Holly is doing well at school, but she has some difficulty reading at her grade level. She has been referred for testing for a possible learning disability. Holly lives in the home of Robert and Anna Boyle in Newport. During my most recent visit to the foster home, and the date is given, Holly said that the Boyles' teenage daughter is like a big sister to her. She said that the family is making plans for their summer vacation together. According to both Carol Lewis, Holly's mother, and the CPS caseworker, Lisa Cromwell, Mrs. Lewis is having difficulty meeting the requirements of her service plan. Mrs. Lewis has not enrolled in a substance abuse treatment program. She has missed 5 of the 6 scheduled appointments with her mental health counselor. Mrs. Lewis did enroll in weekly parenting classes. She attended the first 3 classes and missed the last 2. As part of the service plan, visits between Holly and her mother are scheduled for every Wednesday afternoon from 2:30 to 5 p.m. Mrs. Lewis has been on time for every visit except the most recent one when she was 45 minutes late. When I met Mrs. Lewis, date given, she said she was confused about the requirements of her service plan and that she is unable to find reliable transportation. She explained that she had to drop out of parenting classes because she had no way to get there, and she explained that the transportation problem also caused her to be late for the visit with Holly. Mrs. Lewis said that she loves Holly very much and knows how important her visits are to Holly. She was late for her last visit because she had to walk when she missed the bus. What's better about this? Details. Specifically what? Specifically what? I'm sorry? Sources are cited. What else do you say?
Factual.
It's factual. Somebody said? Dates. What else? Not opinionated. What else?
More balanced. Do you hear the reports of the mother?
More balanced. You hear the reports of the mother as well as the caseworker and others. What else?
Citing their names,
There's more information.
reference names, the foster parents are named, the caseworker is named.
People are named. We know who we're talking about. How about putting things in context when we're talking about how many visits she made? She attended the first 3 and missed the last 2. I think there was another place in there also where we're kind of putting things in context. You know, what's the expectation and to what extent is that being met? See the difference? See the difference?
One last comment about
Sure.
that. Depending, I think, on where you are, we would never be allowed to put the foster parents' names in a report.
That's a
So
very
that
good
might-
point. That's in some jurisdictions, foster parents' names are not permitted in the report. That's something you need to check with in your own program, whether or not that's appropriate. It's not the same across the board, but that's a very good point. Organize your information. Avoid abbreviations. Avoid abbreviations. If you're going to use if you are talking about an agency, for example, that goes by abbreviations, first time spell it out, put it in parentheses, and then you can use the abbreviation after that. But even things like those little and marks and some of the things that we do in our normal, everyday, informal writing really don't belong in a report to the court. One of the things that we ask our volunteers to do, and I'm relating this to you, when you're and I don't know whether or not your programs require it or ask you to do it, when you're handing in your draft of a report, it's real helpful, I think, if you double space it, whether it's on a disc or in handwriting. What would the reason for that be? Sure, it makes it a whole lot easier if you need to make some corrections. And also number your pages. Is there a reason? It seems like a real simple thing, doesn't it? But is there a reason to ask you to number your pages? Well, yeah, that's a real good, I never thought of that, but if you drop it, yeah, make it a whole lot easier to put it back together. But also if somebody's going to give you feedback and you have a copy of your report and they have a copy of your report, it's a whole lot easier to say, well, let's look at the top of page 3 than it is to try to find the word. So it's a simple thing, but try to remember to do it. Would really encourage you to start early. Think about the background sections that we talked about, and the sections about identifying what the case is about and who's who. You could probably do that in the first couple of days or the first couple of weeks of your report. Get that done and get it out of the way. You can keep track of all of your contacts as you go along. So those are 3 stress-related pieces that you can get rid of and focus on the content. I have this in red. Who are the program directors in this room? This is for you. Please submit your reports on time. Okay? Please submit your reports on time. Why is that so important? Why is it important?
For us, so that the judge can have it, because most of the time our judges will review before he even gets into the courtroom.
All right, so judges can have it.
Our judge requires that they be filed 5 days before the hearing, and we meet DHS every time. So.
Good for you. All right, reports in early. How come? How come? Editing. That's another reason. Getting editing done.
Needing to get more information if something isn't clear.
Good. If there's something that's not clear or missing, it gives you a chance to get it. How come?
All parties must have a copy of that report, and many times mom or dad may live down south somewhere in the state, and it'll take a week to get that report.
Other parties have access to your report. If they don't get it, that can be a due process violation, and it, in some instances, could keep your report from even being considered. So get it in. What else?
I supervise several volunteers, and it's occurred that I have like up to 4 to 7 at a time on one report day. So it's just very helpful to have them in early so you can have time to read it correctly.
Thank you. Yes, there may be. You have maybe one report to do, but there may be 20 other people who have a report to do, and one staff person and one secretary to get it all together. So
what do you do if there are changes between the time that you make your report and it comes to the case?
Very good question. The question is, what do you do if there are changes between the time you finish your report and you go to court? Who can tell me? A lot of, you can do a written addendum, real brief, you know, it's like a PS. Hand it in separately. What else? What else can you do?
Well, if you've got the report mostly looked at and you can easily change something or add something in the body before you send it in to the judge.
If your report's in well ahead of time, you can make an amendment. What else can you do? Okay, what else can you do?
We'll give an opportunity, and we verbalize, you know, and if there's something I need to let him know before we even get started, I'll tell my juvenile officer, you know, I need to let him some information before we even get started, and so we communicate that.
Very good. You may have the opportunity to verbally amend your report or verbally update it. Because when you hand in your report, there's a date on it, isn't there? There's a date on it. So if there's something that happened in the meantime, you can let the judge know that verbally or through your program, do a written addendum or even amend your report. The other thing I would suggest to you is expect feedback from your program staff. Expect it. My view is if you hand in a report and nobody ever says to you, here's a way it could be more effective, here's a way it could be better, then I would suggest to you program staff that you're not doing a good service to your volunteers, and to your volunteers that you need to ask for that feedback from the staff. Because every time you write a report, it ought to become easier for you and your reports ought to become better. And the only way we're going to make that happen is by giving constructive feedback. The kind of thing that we're doing today, not just, well, there's some opinion in this report, but here's the example. Here's the example. And let's talk about how we could change that to make it better. And rather having a staff person make the change, let's talk about it with the volunteer. Here's the place where I think you're going to run into a problem. What do you suggest that we do to make it different? And you can offer suggestions and throw it around and see what works. But I think that dialogue, that exchange, is critical to really developing report writing skills. Most of you said that when you submit your reports, they need to be approved by your supervisor, so you want to make sure that you get that done and that you have them in time to make sure that people have a chance to thoroughly review and give you feedback. And the other thing I would suggest is proofread the final copy, because it's possible that there could be a typo or some kind of a mistake that was inadvertently made. Now we've all got computers, and sometimes if there are report formats, maybe the last report name or date or something is still on there and somebody forgot to change it. So you have the responsibility to proofread carefully to make sure that the details are accurate. You also want to make use of the report formats that are provided to you by your program. There's a reason for that. And it's not everything neatly fits in the correct heading, and I'm sure that there's some flexibility within your program so that your reports will make sense. But it really provides a structure not only for you to organize your report, but it also helps the court. If they're looking for something specific in your report, they know where to look. Review other CASA reports, get help from your supervisor, and also assume that the judge knows nothing about the case until they've read your report. What would the reasoning be behind that? I'm sorry? So you can be very specific. What else happens? Sometimes judges change.
We were ready to go to hearing, and our judge had to have an open heart bypass. And so we were in a dilemma. We had no idea who was coming in, whether he would have any knowledge of this case.
Okay. So you had a new person, so you had to be prepared. And also think about multiple cases, multiple cases, multiple cases. Isn't it easy for them all to run together? So you need to think, put yourself in the judge's shoes, see it through the judge's eyes. Expect other people to see your report, the other parties in the case. Does that mean that you should hold back on information that's important. Doesn't mean you shouldn't report it, but it does mean that you need to think about how you're going to say what you want to say. How are you going to say it in a clear, objective way? Check your spelling. Somebody here was asking about spelling, punctuation, grammar. If you have a tough time with that, I would suggest getting yourself a book or taking a course. And quite frankly, I used to teach 4th grade. And there's a lot of good stuff in 4th grade English books. There really is. This is when kids are learning fundamentals. And I think what happens to us is that once we leave school, high school or college, a lot of that formalized writing we don't use anymore in our day-to-day work. When we're writing letters, they're friendly letters or notes where we don't use complete sentences. We're not worried about matching, agreement and all that kind of stuff. And I think those are the kinds of things we need to refresh. And that's what I would suggest to you. You might even want to suggest to your program, how many of you go to in-service, how many of your programs have in-service training? How many of you go to in-service training? Not as many, but I would suggest that you might want to offer that if that's an issue for other people in your program. Maybe suggest to your program director, how about if we do an in-service training and deal with some grammar and punctuation? That's a possibility. Okay. Making your recommendations. Remember that it is so important that your recommendations flow from your facts and evaluation. Here's what I learned. Here's what I think they mean. And therefore, judge, here's what I think you ought to do. But you know what? If you're asking the judge to do something, you want to make sure that the judge has the authority to do it, that it's within the realm of the court's jurisdiction. If there is a case before the judge that has to do with a dependency neglect or an abuse neglect situation, is that a time to recommend termination of parental rights? Not an issue before the court. It's not an issue before the court. What can the judge legally, within their jurisdiction, order? What is realistic? You want to specifically address things like there's usually a petition pending, right? You know what the action is before the court. Should it be granted or not granted? That's the fundamental question, isn't it? So you want to address that. Are there things that the child needs to have happen? What recommendations do you want to make on behalf of that child to address that child's immediate needs? Does the court have the authority to do it? What about the parents? Are there things that they should be doing that they're not doing? Or things that they are doing that they should stop doing? What about the agency? Are there things that you would like to see the agency pay attention to that they may not be paying attention to right now? Or services that need to be provided that are not being provided? Now, have you backed it up with facts? Have you backed it up with facts? And how about review again? Some courts, many courts have regular reviews. If you think a case needs to be reviewed sooner, I think in many jurisdictions you have an opportunity to let the judge know that. Just to review, we've talked about why we write reports, when we write reports, some tips on how to make your reports better and more effective, the importance and the value of using report formats, and we've done a little work along those lines. Thank you all. I appreciate your interest and your participation. I hope you enjoy what's left of the conference, and I hope you learned something.